All right, I'm in God's country, the South. I mean, you see all this garb around me? You see it? You know where I live. Upstate of South Carolina. I'm right here nestled in between the SEC crazies and what's left of the ACC. So Big 12 football is kind of out of sight, out of mind. But this past weekend, the Big 12 had a big weekend. BYU, who was an underdog to UCF, yes, 3-4 UCF. These guys, they won a pretty commanding game. Now, Iowa State, they were off, but they're tied with Clemson at number 11. Of course, you have Kansas State doing their thing. I mean, it is like a miracle recruiting someone to Manhattan, Kansas. And then, of course, our hyped friend out in Boulder, Colorado, Deion Sanders, they're in the top 25. So I was like, I need to have an expert on here to tell us whether they're a contender or a pretender. Are they a playoff contender? And today I have national analyst, national expert John Kurtz on. John, thanks for coming on the show today.
Hey, I appreciate it. Anytime, my friend.
John, you have a great channel, and I have it linked below this video. Just tell us about your experience, what you've done, who you've worked for. I've talked about it before, but I'd really like to hear it from you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I spent a decade working in the industry full-time in a more traditional sense. Kind of the old school way. I came up through radio. I am a K-State grad, a K-State guy. So I hosted a radio show for 10 years in Manhattan covering K-State in the Big 12. I did pregame radio for football and basketball for K-State. Got a chance to travel with them for 10 years up until about 3 years ago. I did some TV broadcasts for K-State and the Big 12 on ESPN Plus. Then in 2021, I moved back to Kansas City, just took a regular day job, but started doing the content on YouTube and then with KC Sports Network, the 3 podcast, and all that's really taken off. So now, as you mentioned, I have my YouTube channel, John Kurtz, under there. I've got a Big 12 newsletter called Open for Business that you can subscribe to at ofbnews.com. And then, the KC Sports Network podcast, 3 the most listened to K-State podcast that is out there. So that's in a nutshell, my background and how I got to this point here.
Yeah, you were on television. I mean, that's big time. Just before we dive into the Big 12, what is it like getting ready to call a game? I mean, what's the prep work that goes into that? Because I think a lot of people are too enamored with the game to realize that those analysts and the commentators, they have to put a lot of work into it, or else they sound stupid.
It's a ton of work. It's a labor of love, but it's a ton of work. And that was my first love. Before I was doing content or hosting shows, like I definitely play-by-play was what I wanted to do the most. It's what I thought I was best at. And really these days it's just a matter of bandwidth and time why I'm not doing it anymore. But you got to put together every play-by-play guy is going to have a big spotting chart. Some guys will do it handwritten, which I actually kind of preferred. A lot of guys will use a computer program, but you've got to be able to have like the 2 deep on both sides of the ball for both teams filled out with all the information. And you can just glance down at a chart. Then when something happens, you've got notes on the guys. All that takes a lot of time. There are, the games that you watch, they're going to be production meetings, figuring out what the storylines are going to be, meeting with everybody back in the truck. And then typically you would have, calls with the coaches throughout the week, where you're going to talk to them, pick their brains, get a little bit of extra information on all the players, what's going on with the team. You're probably going to be watching press conferences, hopefully talking to some players as well. I mean, it's hours and hours of work. So it is hardly a just waltz into the booth and show up, especially for the play-by-play guy. And nothing against the color commentators, but their job can be much more designed to, break down what's unfolding in front of you. Those guys are doing a lot of prep work too at the highest of levels for sure. But the play-by-play guy, you got to be prepared for anything. You've got to know any and every potential storyline that's coming up, and you got to be ready for anybody to be there in the game and know right away who it is and what everybody needs to know about them. So it's a ton of work. And then even once you're on the air, on TV, you're having people talk in your ear at the same time that you are trying to speak out loud. So, I mean, that becomes a pretty tough job too. So I'm like everybody. I will get frustrated at times with a broadcast crew, but I also, knowing what it's like, I have probably a little bit more empathy than a lot of people do.
I bet you do. My heart goes out to you to try to pronounce some of these names, even though they give you a pronunciation key. I mean, sometimes it's like There was some of the players that's played for Clemson over the past 5 years that, I mean, if you get tongue tied, you might be induced to vomiting. I mean, it's just really intense. So, all fun and games there. Well, thanks for being on the show. Let's talk about the Big 12. So I'm here, as I said, in the upstate of South Carolina, very close to the SEC country. In fact, I lived in the shadow of Clemson, but Clemson's very close to the Georgia line. Athens, Georgia is not that far away, so I am in the heart of it. Transparently, the ACC and the SEC fans look at the Big 12 as an afterthought. You know, you lose Oklahoma, you lose Texas, right? The ACC looks like trash, so let's be honest with ourselves. But now you have BYU winning like they did over the weekend. I thought they would blow it because they almost blew it. It was either them or Iowa State almost blew it the week before. Now you have Iowa State tied with Clemson at 11, K-State, and then seeing our old buddy Deion getting to the top 25. How serious are they becoming about like actually being a contender?
Well, I do think the way that the season has played out has been about best case scenario for the Big 12 in a way. It would probably be better if they had a bunch of unbeaten teams and one-loss teams, and some of those were Utah and Oklahoma State, who have a little bit more cachet and brand value. Just the nation trusts that a little bit more than like a BYU or Iowa State, right? There would probably be a bit less skepticism when you've got like Kyle Whittingham's program that's been to a couple of Rose Bowls here in the last 4 years. But the fact that you have two unbeaten teams and everybody's going to be talking into November about two unbeatens in the Big 12, and then you've got a one-loss team in K-State, you've got a two-loss team in Colorado, but that is playing much better and obviously is a draw just because of all the star power that they have and who their head coach is. I think that's your best recipe for getting multiple teams into the playoff, which is a step toward the only way that the Big 12 can actually command some legitimate respect on the national scene, which is going to be just winning games in the playoff. Now, they did do that 2 years ago. You know, I mean, I feel like people forget that TCU beat Michigan, and they were for a long time the last team to have beaten Michigan when they rolled through unbeaten and won the national championship last year. So I feel like the Big 12 probably doesn't get enough credit for that, but that's why you got to go do it. You got to go win some more of those games. And the best way to do that is to have two teams in that playoff, double the chances that you have to get some of those wins. So I like the way a lot of that has played out. As far as, you know, Colorado goes, I do think that they're a legitimate Big 12 title contender. Colorado's a team this year. Last year, there were more flash. There wasn't a lot of substance behind it. This team's got substance, and it's not because, look, they had the stars. I mean, last year, Travis Hunter's great. Shedeur Sanders is great. We know all that, and they're the same. I mean, go look at Shedor's stats right now. I know everybody's enamored with Travis Hunter, as they should be, but Shedor's stat line is incredible. The guy's been a terrific quarterback this year, but the difference is now, like, they have a defense. They have a defense that's gone from being ranked in the hundreds to being ranked in the 40s in a lot of the major statistical categories. Like, they can actually stop people. They brought in a defensive coordinator who's worked with the Cincinnati Bengals for a while, who's done a great job this year. And they have evolved a lot. Basically, since halftime of the Nebraska game, that defense has been pretty darn good. And they have a bit of a running game. You know, I mean, the offensive line is the other thing everybody criticized a lot last year, rightfully so. It's become better. Now, Shedeur still gets hit and hurried probably too much, but they have at least a bit of a running game. It's a respectable running game. They've had 3 or 4 games now where they've rushed over 100 yards, which is all you need when you have Shedeur Sanders and not just Travis Hunter, but a 5 or 6 deep wide receiver core that's as good as almost any in the country. All you need is to be able to run the ball just a little bit. So, yeah, Colorado is legitimately in that discussion. Like, they could make it there, and their schedule is not particularly tough the rest of the way. Out of those 4 teams that you rattled off, BYU, Iowa State, K-State, Colorado, there's only one game between 2 of those teams left in the regular season the rest of the year, and that's K-State, Iowa State on the last week of the regular season. So Colorado, all these teams honestly have a good chance to go through and get to the point where they have double-digit wins, which may make it a little bit tougher for the selection committee to keep some of those teams out and avoid giving the Big 12 an at-large in addition to the auto bid.
Think about the SEC beating up on one another. And I know that if you speak to someone who's an SEC fan, and notice I said SEC fan because they're pulling for all of them. I don't even know how you buy clothes for that. I mean, like, that has to get expensive. Hopefully there's some overlapping colors to where you're like, oh, that's my That's my A&M and Mississippi State shirt, whenever I'm pulling for them. But the thought is, I mean, the SEC is beating up on one another. I mean, do you see a 3-loss SEC team going in front of, say, a 1-loss Big 12 team just because of something you spoke about just a moment ago? Brand. Old timers would call it tradition. New timers calls it brand. Do you see that because of the brand perception of the Big 12? Do you see that happening?
That's really like the $1 million question this year. It's hard to know because it's going to come down to the selection committee. I mean, if it were up to the AP voters, I think it's a very good chance that a 3-loss SEC team would get in over a 1-loss Big 12 team, because we've kind of seen that reflected in the polls. I mean, I hear from a lot of Big 12 fans every week when that poll comes out. They're very annoyed with a lot of things. I mean, Missouri's hanging on ranked for God's sake right now, which I don't understand how that's happened at all. But I think the playoff selection committee has been a little bit more lenient toward the Big 12. Like I mentioned, I'm a K-State guy. 2 years ago, K-State won the Big 12, went to the Sugar Bowl. And at the end of the regular season, they actually had 3 losses. That was a 9-3 regular season before they then beat TCU in the Big 12 championship game. And in that last regular season college football playoff poll, 3-loss K-State was ranked 10th in the playoff poll. So they were getting a lot of respect from the committee. I think we have seen some examples of that with them being more open to it. And I think because of that, one of the key factors here is that you've got Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti in these meetings they've been having in Nashville. One of the things they're talking about is whether or not they actually want a playoff selection committee to be a part of the process moving forward with the playoff when they almost inevitably expand beyond 12. And I think that's because they have a bit of a fear of that. Maybe our 9-3 teams aren't going to get the benefit of the doubt there, and we need to make sure that that happens if it doesn't. So I think all that evidence would point toward there's at least a shot of that happening. It would take the right circumstance. It would take, for instance, if BYU loses in the Big 12 championship game to an 11-1 K-State or an unbeaten Iowa State, something like that, they're obviously going to have a much better chance than if BYU loses one of the other games that they have down the stretch, like to a Utah who's free falling right now. That's a loss that would not work as well. And it seems like the only team that gets the benefit of the doubt with a bad loss right now is Notre Dame, who's still hanging on to that Northern Illinois loss, but yet is in the top 10. I don't think you're going to get that level of benefit of the doubt for the Big 12. So, it all depends on how it goes down. But I do think that there is at least a chance of that happening.
When you look at the AP Top 25, you see the leniency you talked about offered to the SEC, and I get it. I'm not going to go against that to a point. But then there's some teams I'm sitting there kind of going, all right, as the season goes on, they can't hide anymore. They can't hide behind the SEC banner. We're starting to see that with the Big Ten. I would say with the Big Ten, Penn State is still hiding behind the banner. I think they stick out like a sore thumb in the top 7. I would go as far as say the top 10, but maybe that's pushing it. So Notre Dame getting, I mean, my God, they jumped, 4 spots after beating the crap out of Navy. And yeah, Navy is doing all right. And that's a good story and so on. But 4 spots, I mean, good grief. Let's talk about the team that you believe the most, like you believe they are the team to get into the college football playoff at this point. Out of the Big 12, who do you think makes it to the college football playoff? And second part of that, the second team, if there is a second team.
Yeah, I think a lot of the discussion lately, obviously in Big 12 circles, is centered around, all right, like, if we're power ranking the Big 12, like, what are you doing with BYU and Iowa State right now with both teams unbeaten? I think you would make the argument that BYU has the better resume because they have a win at SMU, who has not lost since that game and now is into the top 25. And they also beat K-State 38-9. It was a bit of a wild game where, K-State dominated actually success rate in that game. If you ever watch Parker Fleming's graph, like, did we actually get beat that bad? It looked like K-State should have won the game, but they lost 38-9 because of a bunch of turnovers. But still, that's a really impressive looking win. So I think resume wise, you have to say BYU is going to get the edge over Iowa State, whose best win is a win at Iowa in comeback fashion. And it was a great one. But it's not going to hold up to what BYU has done. However, and this, BYU fans are probably tired of hearing this stuff because people keep saying things like this and expecting them to lose, but they don't. They continue to win, and they are getting better. But I do feel like Iowa State has a higher ceiling out of the two, mainly just because I believe a bit more in their passing game. So I think they have more ways to beat you. If you get BYU down by a couple of scores, I don't know that they're going to be able to throw themselves back into the game. They've got a great defense, and Jake Retzloff, their quarterback, has been worlds better than last year. And they do have a couple of receivers, Chase Roberts, Darius Lassiter, like those guys are pretty good. But I just don't quite see the high level talent there that like Iowa State has two, I think, NFL receivers. Rocco Becht has been a really good quarterback, like someone who's been more comfortable pushing the ball downfield throughout his career than Jake Retzloff, and less turnover prone. That's always been an issue with Retzloff too. So I still feel like Iowa State has the slight edge there. I don't think K-State is too far behind. The game in Provo, as I mentioned, was one where, you've got a young quarterback, Avery Johnson, first year starting, a sophomore, incredibly talented. But that was the first time he went through a bunch of adversity in a tough road environment, and you could just see it totally snowball on him. It seems like he's matured quite a bit. We saw that at Colorado. When they got down late, he threw him right back into the game, drove him down the field, won the game at Colorado, which is a pretty good-looking win right now. And I think just from an overall talent standpoint, K-State's roster has as much or more talent than either Iowa State or BYU too. Now, K-State also has the toughest schedule. They're going to wind up playing at BYU, at Colorado, and at Iowa State by the time the season is done. So that's part of the issue there. I don't know that they're going to win in Ames because that's such a tough spot. So I would give Iowa State the edge because of that, even though I think K-State, in terms of caliber of team, is right there with Iowa State and BYU. So the tough part for me is whether or not BYU loses a game before the Big 12 championship game. If they don't, then I think you could very well be looking at Iowa State beating BYU in the Big 12 championship game, and then wondering if BYU is going to get in with one loss, which I think they would have a decent chance to do. Probably put that as the slightly more likely outcome. But K-State could be in that discussion. Colorado could too. I'm not sure that I'm quite to that level with them. I would put those three above Colorado, especially because Colorado's got that second loss. They have that loss to Nebraska, which was fairly ugly early in the year hanging around. I think that will hurt their at-large chances in all of that discussion too. So long way of saying I think it's Iowa State 1, probably BYU 2, K-State 3.
I think what would help the SEC, not the SEC, but the Big 12 and the ACC is to see a few teams in the SEC go ahead and get to 3 losses, but not enough of them to where it like recalibrates the approach of the committee, to where the committee's like, oh, but look at these 3 or 4 teams with 3 losses, but who it was to, and it was a close. You get where I'm going there? I think that helps the Big 12, and it helps the ACC get teams in potentially into the playoff versus just a bunch of 3-loss SEC teams. One thing before we go, because I know your schedule's tight and I appreciate you coming on. Everybody, I have a link to John Kurt's channel below this video, so go over there, let him know that you saw him on this channel, and subscribe. Do you see the Big Ten and or the SEC expanding anymore? And if so, who do you think gets cherry-picked from each conference?
Yeah, it's a tough question now because, for a while I felt it was pretty inevitable that Florida State and or Clemson would wind up in one of those leagues. And to be honest, the way that was trending for a while, I felt like it made a lot more sense for the Big Ten because they've been this like kind of coast to coast conference, whereas the SEC is like the one league still hanging out there actually making sense geographically. And it seems like that's something that does matter to them. And they obviously already have a presence in both states that you would be pulling those schools from. So I thought, hey, the Big Ten getting into Florida, getting into South Carolina, just getting into the South would make a lot of sense there. Then we saw, right toward the beginning of football season, the news that like, hey, the ACC may actually be able to work something out here. Basically because it seems like the court cases were just going to be too long and drawn out and it wasn't going to make anybody happy. So now, maybe for the time being, Florida State and Clemson will find a way to get some extra money there. I think that's at least throwing a wrench into the process. That's basically where I would look. I think it's those two and Notre Dame. I'm not sure that anybody else is going to move the needle enough for right now, at least until the next TV contracts start to come up in around 2030. And that's when, people have been pushing like Super League ideas. I don't think anything goes into effect like the ones that we've seen proposed, but maybe there are tenets of that wind up coming around, and maybe that will force a lot of different realignment. You'll just have more flexibility and options because the leagues won't be tied down by TV contracts then. So I think between now and then, the only things that are going to really make things move, the only dominoes that would really fall to make things move would be if something happens with the ACC and Florida State and Clemson, or if Notre Dame, for whatever reason, and maybe it is something college football playoff related. For instance, right now, they can't get one of the top 4 seeds in a bye. If something like that forces Notre Dame to say, all right, fine, we'll join a conference. I think those are the things that would start dominoes to fall. And then maybe other schools outside of that group of 3 would be included there for whatever reason. They want to make it an even number, traveling partner, whatever it's going to be. That's kind of the way I see the landscape right now.
I got you. I could definitely see that. The expansion of the Big 10 just going coast to coast and the whole southeastern part, that's what made sense to me. But we will see. John, I talked about your channel. The link is below the video. Where else can we find you?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So yeah, it's just John Kurtz on YouTube. I have a Big 12 newsletter that's out 3 times a week, open for business. You can subscribe at ofbnews.com. And then if you want to listen to my K-State podcast, it's on KC Sports Network. But wherever you find podcasts, just search 3MAW, 3MAW. That is the K-State podcast if you want to get that. And you can follow me on Twitter at JL Kurtz as well.
That's awesome. John, thanks for coming on today. Folks, go over to his channel. Let him know you saw him on here. Subscribe and drop him a nice comment. Folks, Clemson and Louisville is coming up this week. It's a big one. This team's only lost 3 games, 7 points apiece. So it's a big one for us. I'll be talking about that later on. Folks, you take care of yourself. And as always, go Tigers.